Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. We're so glad you could join us for our February briefing. We're going to jump real quick into it to make the most of our speakers' time. I am so delighted to have with us our first repeat presenter, Jared Abbott. He presented some really interesting findings at one of our earliest briefings, probably almost 2 years ago, when there was just a handful of us. And now look at us, we've grown, and we're thrilled to have him back to cover maybe a little bit of what he covered back then, and also some really exciting new research that his organization has put out. Jared's a political scientist, and he's the founder of the Center for Working Class Politics, which is really doing some of the most groundbreaking research of trying to really get a better handle on what most appeals to working class voters, both substantively and rhetorically. And for what we really love here at RUBI is they pay very close attention to rural voters and try and understand whether there's any distinctions in rural or class voters. So we love them, we love their work, and I'm sure you will too. So Jared, thanks so much for being here, and let's get started.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody for being here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with you all. So yeah, as Erica said, I'm a part of the Center for Working Class Politics, which is a research collective of political scientists, a couple of union bureaucrats, sociologists, and historians. And we are focused on doing a range of different types of analyses related to the question of, as the name suggests, working class politics. We carry out surveys, focus groups, interview projects, and we're doing several, which I'll preview a little bit of today, large-scale data collection projects of candidate class and messaging styles. And so one of the main things that we've been focused on, as Eric also alluded to, is trying to understand how progressive candidates can appeal most effectively to working class voters. Now, one of the challenges of doing this observationally, that is by just looking at candidates who have run in the past, is that there actually are not a lot of progressive candidates who have run in highly working class areas, and similarly, not a lot who have run, well, at least not competitive races in highly rural areas as well. And so it's difficult to just use past candidates' sort of experiences to draw conclusions about the types of messaging and the types of candidate characteristics that make the most sense in these sorts of areas. That is to say, highly working class areas, and as I'll focus on today, in rural and small town congressional districts, or, it doesn't have to be congressional districts, could be obviously state level races or municipal races even. So what we have been doing at the Center for Working Class Politics is carrying out what are called survey experiments, where we basically we create all these different thousands and thousands of permutations of hypothetical candidates who vary across a bunch of different characteristics, which I'll get into. And then we do surveys among different groups of voters and adults in general, even including non-voters. And we try to use these techniques to isolate the characteristics that would be most appealing to different groups of people. And since we're sort of randomly assigning all kinds of different characteristics to these candidates, we can actually sort of estimate the effect without a great deal of bias. Now, the degree to which obviously any survey is a match with what actually happens in the real world is a separate question, obviously. But this is a technique that we have found to be pretty useful in disentangling the differential or the varied effects of different kinds of campaign messaging and candidate characteristics. So I'm going to present a little bit of evidence from two different surveys that we've done in the last couple of years that Erica had expressed interest in hearing more about. one of which I talked about last time I was here a couple years ago, which was a survey of just non-college educated potential Democratic voters. That is to say, we excluded sort of strong Republicans from this data set because we were looking at persuadable voters, and we looked at 5 swing states. And then we oversampled in rural small town areas so that we could, say things about what's going on there. And in our second survey, we sort of learned a lot from the first one, and we tried to modify the design in different ways, replicate some of the analyses or see if they were replicable, and try to zoom in on a couple of particular characteristics of candidates that we found to be most interesting in the first survey. And so I'm going to basically sort of present some of the results of both of these surveys to sort of give you a broader sort of bird's eye view of the different things that we found that are consistent and differ across these different surveys. And in this survey, we didn't just look at non-college educated voters. We looked at just a nationally representative sample, which again, oversampled for rural voters. But in this case, we can sort of compare working class versus middle class attitudes in a way that we couldn't when we obviously just looked at non-college educated voters. So because this is the RUBI, I'm not going to just talk about working class voters in general. I'm going to talk about basically divisions or convergences between small town rural voters and suburban urban voters in our survey. And this is obviously a distinct but a pretty closely related cleavage to the class divide. And I'll talk about some of the nuances of that as I go through. Now, there's probably no way that I'll get through all of the stuff that I have prepared because this is sort of a new version of this presentation, which has some new items, and so I apologize in advance. I'll get as far as I can, but just so that sort of what the punchlines are at the beginning, there are 4. The first one is that sort of based on the work that we've done from this sort of experimental analysis, the first thing that we find is that progressives should be running more populist-oriented campaigns. Rural small-town voters consistently prefer populist candidates who do some combination of sort of talk about the great virtues of ordinary working-class people on the one hand, and condemn the rapaciousness of political and economic elites on the other. While suburban and urban voters are essentially indifferent to those sorts of candidates. And so there's not really much of a trade-off across geography. Interestingly, as I'll mention a little bit later, Democrats are kind of allergic to populist language. Most Democrats, including in sort of more rural areas, working class areas, just don't offer campaigns along these lines. Some do, and I'll mention a couple, but in general, Democrats do not. And I think that based on our research, that's a problem. Second, even though this may be obvious to many folks, it's important to keep testing and to show in different kinds of ways that, especially in 2024, when there's obviously lots of debates about the relative utility of focusing on, say, abortion or sort of resistance to the radical right, our research results suggest pretty consistently that rural small-town voters and working-class voters generally find bread and butter issues much more appealing, than other kinds of issues, and they want candidates to focus on those things, like jobs and sort of economic growth in general. Now, one slight caveat to that, which we found in our second survey, and which we're finding in sort of follow-up surveys that we're working on now, is that in general, this isn't true for working class voters overall, who actually did have some positive reactions to things like, government jobs plan, for instance. But rural small town voters, did not react positively to overly progressive economic messaging. So, things like raising the minimum wage too much, or, large tax hikes on the rich, or things that, maybe seemed like they implied a lot of government intervention, or, increasing the size of government, they did not react positively to, but they did react positively to things like jobs programs or jobs training programs, and economically and focused policies that were a little bit less overarching or bold, you might say, than some of the more progressive things that we tested. Next, there's no one size fits all to cultural issues, basically, is what we've been finding. We find pretty consistently that immigration and gun policies, especially when they're presented in a progressive version, can be quite damaging to candidates, particularly among rural small town voters, but also working class voters in general. But there are other issues like abortion, where we find that even a sort of pretty progressive version of abortion, talking about the sort of unrestricted access to abortion, say, didn't really hurt candidates in our surveys, even though we know that some of those more progressive versions of abortion policy do not enjoy majority support in the U.S., even if there is majority support for more limited versions of abortion access. And then there's other kinds of issues where the degree to which candidates are going to be hurt by campaigning on these issues, or campaigning too progressively on these issues, kind of varies, which I'll try to talk about a little bit if I have time. And then finally, we find that progressives should be running more working class and also small business candidates. We find pretty consistently, again, across both of our surveys and other work that we've been doing, that rural small town voters, like working class voters in general, are very turned off by professional and upper class candidates. And they prefer candidates from sort of blue collar backgrounds, or even sort of like teachers or nurses, or candidates who are small business owners, much more than any kind of professional candidate or upper class candidate. Whereas suburban and urban voters are basically indifferent in our surveys to these differences in candidate occupation or background. So again, that's a sort of easy thing to do, and there's not much of a trade-off. Interestingly, well, I'll talk about this a little bit. There are a fair number of candidates running in primarily rural and small town congressional districts who do meet these characteristics, particularly small business candidates. But the large majority of candidates are actually from professional backgrounds, or are from sort of larger business owners, even in places like this. And we think that that's a problem for sort of effectively or credibly reaching out to working class or rural small town voters as well. So those are the main takeaways. I'll go through some of these in some detail. I'm not going to get to all of them, obviously, but just to give you a brief sense, what we did is this is just one of the surveys, just to sort of, you can see it, basically what we did. We randomly varied candidates' race, ethnicity, their gender. In this survey, it was day one priority and different sorts of issues in different issue areas. And then we had different sorts of sound bites that were more or less populist in orientation. We asked them, we had variation in different sorts of occupational backgrounds and political affiliations. I'm not going to show you the other survey options. I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of what it looked like. And then this is literally what it looked like, where somebody would see candidate A and candidate B, and each candidate would be assigned one value for each of the different characteristics or types of rhetoric. And each candidate would get just random assignment of each of those. And then we do this 6 or 7 times for each respondent, and we end up with 20-some thousand candidates to compare across all these different characteristics. And so I'm going to start with talking about the populism results. Basically, you can read these for a minute here, and I'm happy to share all these slides with folks that want to get into this in more detail. But basically, we wanted to know, does populist language sort of matter or help candidates with working class, and in this case, rural small town voters? And we sort of used language in the first survey. We used language directly from candidates, slightly altered in a couple of cases, just for readability. One is what we call the progressive populist, which is language from Bernie Sanders, which is basically sort of knocking the super rich for screwing up things for ordinary people who work for a living. And then tied in with good jobs, wages, sort of bread and butter economic issues. Then we have an activist progressive, what we're calling it, which is language taken from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is also sort of slamming the people in power, but using language that we argue is coded more sort of activist language that is not as sort of straightforward and simple and directly focused on bread and butter issues as the progressive populist. And then we have a sort of activist moderate version, which is similar kind of rhetorical style to the activist progressive, but doesn't critique the power elite in the same way. And then we have the quote from Joe Biden, which we're calling the mainstream moderate, which would have been in 2020, sort of not critiquing the economic elites, talking about building bridges between the geographic divides and partisan divides and using common sense to get things done. And then we came up with an amalgam Republican candidate to be the kind of foil to all these Democratic messages. And what we found is that there's a red squiggly on the screen now, which is kind of funny. But what we found is that basically, this is also true for working class voters, which I'm not showing you, but small town rural voters responded most positively. You can see in the top panel here, the blue dots are the rural small town. They responded most positively to the progressive populist, which is the sort of Sanders style, calling out the elites and raising up ordinary working people. And mainstream and sort of suburban and urban voters also didn't react negatively to that language. So we basically conclude from this that using populist language is more effective than even the kind of Biden style reach across the aisle, but also sort of focused on bread and butter issues that got him elected president. And the only kind of trade-off is that the folks in suburban and urban settings sort of were more favorable toward the Biden style messaging than people in working class, or excuse me, small town and rural areas. So populism seems to be most effective among small town and rural people here. And then in our second survey, what we tried to do was we wanted to test populism in a different way. And the way that we did that was, rather than having these sort of like more fleshed out versions of actual language that real people in campaigns used, we tried to come up with language that was sort of more concise and that had specific elements that we could vary so that we could see the exact effect of moving from one kind of populist language to another. And so in these messages, we basically had populism defined as, one, people-centric, language that raises up the value and importance of ordinary working Americans, and one, anti-elitism, which is language that explicitly calls out economic or political elites for causing many of the big problems that ordinary Americans face. And so we basically did different permutations of both of these. So we had one where it was just anti-populist, somebody that sort of appeals to expertise and is against extremism. One where the candidate raised up ordinary people, but didn't critique economic elites, which would be similar to, say, Joe Biden, who uses this sort of language a lot. We have another one that's like the same thing, but rather than talking about the people in general, talks about the working class, but also doesn't critique elites. And then we have three versions of this messaging that are what we're calling populist, because they both raise up ordinary people and also critique or call out elites. One version where there's a sort of calling out politicians for being corrupt and for causing America's ills, and then another version which calls out economic elites for the same thing. And then another one where we sort of tested language that includes a call out across racial division in order to show the value of sort of counteracting tactics used by different groups to try to pit a racial group against each other and say that we should all come together and fight against economic elites. So those are the different sorts of populist messaging that we used for the second survey, and the results were pretty similar. The key result here is on the top left-hand corner, where you can see that we just pool together all the different messages that were considered populist and those that were considered not populist. And you can see that the blue dots again are the small town rural voters, and we can see that they were viewed much more. They viewed populist much more positively than not populist, and that again there was basically no difference in how suburban and urban voters thought about populists versus non-populists. And then on the right-hand side, we can see basically that the non-populist pieces of messaging like anti-populism and then the sort of raising up ordinary working people didn't do as well as the political populism or the economic populist messaging, but the racially inclusive economic populist messaging didn't do as well as the other two. So again, testing populist language in a completely different way than we did in our first survey, but finding pretty similar results that candidates should be focusing on populist messaging. And we find here, this is just saying that within rural and small town voters, that preference for populist messaging is very much centered around the working class residents of those areas. And so by working class residents, this is being measured as occupationally working class, so like a service worker or a manual worker. And that, it's only the rural small town working class voters who are really positive toward populists, and even the working class voters in urban and suburban areas don't make as much of a distinction. So that's a really effective type of messaging for working class, rural, and small town respondents. I'm going to skip over this one because I'm quickly running out of time. The last thing to say is that we actually looked at all Democratic TV ads in competitive races. There's about 800 of them that we found, and we just transcribed all of them and did a text analysis of them to see, what percentage of people are running as populists in some competitive districts as Democrats, and the answer is very few. There are a few that do a great job. I have a couple of examples here. Tony Vargas, who ran a good campaign, but ended up losing in Nebraska 7 in 2022. And Mike Levin from California 49, and there's, maybe 6 or 8 others that did a great job of effective populist messaging, but only about 5% of people mentioned any of the sort of keywords of, the millionaires or even insulin prices, which was a big deal for a lot of folks on the campaign, and big pharma. These just hardly ever came up in these ads, and only about 20% overall of these ads mentioned or called out economic elites in any way. So even though we're finding that this populist messaging is really effective, or can be, that's not really translating into Democrats on the campaign trail. So, or at least not yet. So, Erica, we're about at 20 minutes. I don't know if it would make sense to just go on a little bit more, or if I could just, if people had questions about, I could just go back to the key takeaway slide, and if somebody had specific things they were interested in about some of the other key takeaways, we could just go to those slides. It's whatever you prefer.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be good to just at least cover this next slide you've queued up, and then maybe we'll go to questions, and then at that point you can pull up other slides as needed.
Okay, perfect. So we also wanted to know, in our first survey, we found that we actually kind of bundled up, sort of like substantive economic issues with sort of like the rhetorical messaging of populism. So like that Bernie Sanders message I showed you said, that he was against elites and for working people, and that he was going to fight for progressive like economic policies at the same time. But in the second survey, we sort of broke those up, and you can see we just showed you the specific rhetorical messaging around populism. But then we also wanted to know, well, what happens when candidates combine the rhetorical messaging around populism with progressive economic policies? And so basically, just as a sort of a baseline, in the first survey, we found that, working class voters, but also small and rural town voters, small town and rural voters, who are, again, the blue dots, they very much preferred candidates who focused on jobs and the economy over those who focused on things like, racial justice or immigration. But we kind of wanted to break that down in our second survey to look at, well, what are the types of specific issues, like, and like, what if you do a moderate version or a progressive version of those issues, and what happens when you sort of interact those with rhetorical populist messaging? And so that's what I have here. I'm just showing you the example of the political populist. So that's the person who's, raising up ordinary people and then critiquing political elites. And you see here that, when candidates ran on progressive economic issues, like a large tax hike on the rich, or a federal jobs guarantee, or a large increase in the minimum wage, that substantially hurt their performance when they were also populist. So in this case, we find that, actually combining sort of like a Bernie Sanders style progressive populist economic program with the rhetorical styling of anti-elite, pro-ordinary people, working people, isn't particularly effective. And then we find that the most effective way to employ populist language in conjunction with economic policy is to do so, in this case, on a small tax hike on the rich. And we actually find in the new survey that we haven't published yet, that which is focused just on jobs policies that Democrats can offer to working class people, we find that things like opposition to trade, to bad trade deals, and bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States. These are the types of issues that are sort of most effective among sort of working class voters and small town rural voters, more so than some of the, sort of more expansive, government programs, say like a jobs guarantee, which makes me very sad because, I think those are very important policies, but, this is what we're finding. So that's basically it. And also, the last thing I'll say is that the issue of, like, should you campaign, or how can you campaign on sort of like cultural issues among small town and rural voters, we find a lot of variation. So on the one hand, on the right hand side here, you can see that the blue dot next to decriminalize immigration at the border, that's our sort of progressive immigration policy. That was the, only about 36% or 37% support in our second survey, whereas the centrist immigration policy, which is secure the border, which is not far off from what the president is now saying, it got like over 60% support. So there's a huge gap in the effect of candidates' messaging around immigration. And so that's a really, really important finding for us. And we find something less dramatic, but also a pretty large difference in the effect of sort of progressive messaging around guns, in terms of banning assault rifles, versus something more kind of anodyne like red flag gun laws, where we see a pretty large gap as well. But we didn't see any gap among sort of progressive versus moderate abortion policies. And that's sort of interesting because we think that what's probably going on here is that, people are seeing all these things all at once, and the ones that really jump out to them were the immigration and the guns policies. And so they were voting on the basis of those and not on the abortion policies. And then the last thing I'll just show you is that we also did an analysis of all these campaign ads, and just so basically no Democrats talk about any like controversial progressive cultural issues ever on the campaign trail. So these are all the different terms that we looked at, that could be like some sort of divisive cultural issue, and Democrats just don't talk about them at all. The only one they talk about is abortion, and they talk about that a lot in 2022, and they probably will again. And the reason why you see that some of them talked about defund the police is because there were 10 of them, and they were saying how much they hated defund the police and that they didn't want to do it. And 4 of those people won their races: Sanford Bishop, Jared Golden, Marcy Kaptur, and Dan Kildee. So it's interesting that, these folks, could get punished by, running on these sort of progressive sort of cultural issues if they're not careful. But it seems like there's quite a lot of message discipline already around these issues, which, depending on your political orientation, would be good or bad. But yeah, so I'll stop there, and I'm going to go back to the slide where I showed you my key takeaways. And then if anybody wants to talk about the sort of candidates and what types of backgrounds, they should have in, based on our research findings. I'd love to talk about that, but I'll pause there. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk with you all.
Great, thanks so much. There is so much there. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of questions. So folks, I wanna let you know, Jared has a hard stop at 1:45, 1:50.
We can go to 150. Yeah, I just have to run to class. I apologize, folks.
Yeah, so I think what I'd like to propose is let's start with just real questions for Jared, hopefully just short questions, and we'll use his time wisely for him to be able to address those. And then after he goes, if folks want to stay on and have more discussion, we can do that at that point. So let's see.
I've got several from the chat if you want.
That would be great. And, I actually can't, Jared, I can't actually see. Oh, wait a minute. I was going to say maybe you have to take your screen share down, but okay, I think I can. Yeah, so folks, go ahead and raise your hand in the chat, or not in the chat, in the, well, you all know how to do it. Or write your question in the chat, and Anthony and I'll be combing through those.
Yeah, okay, so I'll start with a few. I think some of these partially were answered as you went further, Jared, but Mark asked, what is a progressive message on gun control? And it looks like your slide distinguished between banning assault weapons versus red flag laws. Is there anything else to say about the difference between the progressive message that wasn't well received and one that was well received?
Yeah, no, it was just, sort of one of those, the number one way in which, progressives were messaging around gun control was banning assault weapons in 2022. So that's what we focused on in our analysis.
Okay, all right. Folks asked about how you're defining economic elites. Who are the economic elites? And is that sort of a message opposed to the economic elites? Is it essentially a corporate greed message, or is it something else?
Okay. So that is, you can see here, basically the economic elites are defined pretty broadly. We're defining it, in this messaging basically just as sort of super rich elites. So it is the implication there clearly being something related to greed or the glaring sort of wealth inequality. But these are pretty limited sound bites, so people are going to read into them what they will. But I think, yes, the main focus is going to be on extreme wealth, which we're implying here is moving the country in a way that is hurting working class people.
Okay. Erica, do you want me to keep going, or do you want to ask some raised hand questions?
Sure, I'll pop in with one. Someone wanted to know if you break your results down for different racial groups.
Yeah, we do, and I mean, I can't, that's really important, obviously, but we didn't, I didn't have a lot of time here. We definitely do find that, rural and small town African-American voters and are actually less they were less affected by populism than the white ones were. So in other words, the populist candidates didn't resonate with them in the same way as they did with white, rural, and working class voters. And we also found, not surprisingly, because, African-American voters tend to be more progressive on most economic issues than white voters in general, that they, were more positive toward the sort of progressive economic issues. But of course, we know that even though there are in a couple of states, like Georgia, obviously the rural African-American population is very large and is a very important part of the electorate. But I didn't disaggregate all of these in this presentation because there are a lot of other states that are important swing states where the rural small town population is of African Americans is pretty small. But I would love to do another presentation where we could get into some of those nuances. The Latino responses were also pretty interesting and a little bit there was a sense of the stuff like immigration, was still negatively received, the progressive immigration policies, but not as negatively as among, say, white working class, or excuse me, white rural small town voters. So, if the person asked that question, I'm happy to follow up with you and literally just send you some of those results if you're interested.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, Erica, that kind of combines two questions that have been asked. One is, putting it simply, and I think again you kind of just answered this, but I'll ask it again. If these questions, the questions in your two surveys, were asked to rural and working class white voters versus rural and working class non-white voters, would the responses be the same, or how would they differ? Again, you started to respond to that, but maybe you could say a little more. And related to that, earlier on, Beth asked what does this all mean for the whole goal of kind of a racial solidarity approach, the kind of race class narrative approach, where we're saying it's all of us working folks and struggling people versus the elites. So kind of two pieces to that.
Okay, yeah, so that's a great question. So on the first part, I mean, I just, I didn't have time I don't have a lot of appendices and stuff here, so I apologize. I don't have the actual, across race results here, which you can find in our report, Trump's Kryptonite, which is available online. But basically, so like I said, for the populist messaging, generally speaking, the white sort of working class, small town, rural voters, were more affected by populist messaging than Black voters were, although Black working class voters were much more affected by it in a positive way than sort of middle class Black voters. And then when it comes to the policy stuff, it's sort of what you would probably expect, that if we were to look at the day one priority, the racial justice priority of small town and rural African Americans is more positive than for white working class or white small town rural voters. Immigration is a little bit higher, but not a lot. And then when it comes to these policies, the African Americans were, working class folks were much more positive toward these more progressive economic issues than were working class and small town rural white voters. So, there is a sense in which, those are target populations for progressives and small town rural progressives that are great, because they're pretty much more closely aligned with progressive policies than small town rural white voters, which probably doesn't come as much of a shock or surprise to anybody here. So, and then on the question of the race class narrative stuff, I mean, we did a version of the race class narrative in our second survey, and I say a version because if somebody from that project were here, they would say that and they probably justifiably say that it's a little bit simplistic, and we had to kind of do a sort of very, very bare bones version of something that's like that. So we said, instead of saying Americans who work for a living are being portrayed by super rich elites, we said white, brown, and Black Americans who work for a living are being portrayed by super rich elites. Politicians need to listen more to working class people. Working class Americans of all races and backgrounds need to come together and elect leaders who will fight for us all against corrupt millionaires. So we found there that on the whole, that messaging didn't do as well as the sort of you might call class or race blind versions of political populism and economic populism. Though if I could show you the results among like urban working class people, who are obviously much more likely to be African American, that messaging did significantly better than it did, among small town rural voters. So, I think that it's a story of that kind of messaging does better among, working class folks of color than it does among working class whites, it seems, but it doesn't, there's not a huge, sort of negative or positive impact either way. But again, this is just one version of that. And, it's a sophisticated framework, and, those folks have done a lot of different testing. So, so take that for what it is. But that's sort of what we tried to incorporate into our study to address that in a limited way.
Okay, great.
Eric,
Why don't we go to?
Yeah, go ahead to a question,
Sorry.
but I did want to make sure before he gets off, several people have asked about his definition of progressive candidates. How much of it has to do with education level? How much is it the way they talk, or is it who they are? Before you get to the questions, because there have been several of those in the chat, could you just speak to that, and then I'll shut up.
Okay, so yeah, so I mean, that's basically when I say progressive candidates, I just mean people that are focused on a progressive agenda, right? So folks who are trying to push for economic and social justice, essentially, to a greater or lesser degree. So obviously, our results are could be useful to any Democrat, or any candidate, really. But our sort of motivation, and that's why I said, progressive candidates, is that, we were trying, and that's why we included like all this progressive language that, most obviously there's very few candidates that talk about jobs guarantee. There's very few candidates that talk about, like decriminalizing immigration. But what we wanted to do was see, like, what are the, if progressives really did go into these areas, because, like sort of like card carrying progressives don't really campaign in small. I mean, obviously there's people in this room, I'm sure, that do, and that's wonderful. But as we all know, it's not super common. Hence, groups like yours exist trying to make it more common. So that was partly what we were trying to do, was to sort of bring in some language that's more progressive than what you would get on an ordinary, survey by a, Democratic consultant, so that we could sort of understand how sort of like legit, genuine progressives candidates might fare in these contexts, if that makes sense. Like,
Sure.
think of like a Working Families Party candidate, or somebody like that.
Murray, you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure, just two quick ones. First, are you aware of the work of the patriotic millionaires, who are the wealthy people in America, saying tax us? And then the second part is, when I noticed there was something about a candidate saying bring back jobs, but isn't that somewhat disingenuous if the economic policies that we have in this country right now favor the wealthiest people and corporations? So you're telling somebody in a rural place that, yeah, I'm going to bring back the jobs, but the very things that could do that are actually hurting those people. And if they aren't aware of it, how are we going to move beyond that without talking about that? And we can't ignore that, I don't think.
Yeah, for sure. Those are big, tough questions. I mean, yeah, I have heard of patriotic millionaires. I think that's great, and they probably, if any of you are on the call today, I apologize for saying that we should go attack millionaires and billionaires. And yes, there is obviously a lot of difficulty in campaigning on things like bringing back jobs, when the political economic realities, on the ground make that difficult. But of course, as we know, there is a sense in which the Biden administration's economic policies, as limited as they were relative to some of their original versions, they sort of are opening the door to new possibilities and investment in new industries in sort of depressed areas of the country, to create infrastructure jobs and to create manufacturing jobs in new sectors through some sort of strategic forms of investment, in particular competitive sectors. And so I think there is a real sense that could happen. And so I don't think that this is just mere rhetoric, although even when Donald Trump uses it as mere rhetoric, it is also effective. But that can't go on for forever. So there does need to be a politics behind it. And the degree to which what we're saying conflicts with the Patriotic Millionaires Project, I mean, I don't really think so. I think back to FDR. He understood that in 1936, in order for him to beat Huey Long and to push back the Townsend movement and all these people to his left, like he needed to connect with ordinary Americans who were really pissed off by what was happening in their country. And so he started talking about economic royalists, and he started talking about the need to put these folks in check. And so I think even if you don't actually just from a pure strategic perspective, Democrats are not being taken seriously by working class people who think that they're out of touch, who think that, they're the party of the so-called Brahmin left, right? And we, as Democrats and progressives, we need to do everything that we can to try to build that credibility back. And I think a big part of that is using language which actually plays into the fears and hopes and anxieties and angers of ordinary working people, which is derived a lot from their anger at elites, which includes, obviously the economic elites. So yeah, that's what I would say.
There have been a couple questions that people would like to maybe see an example of what you mean by a populist message. And that ties into a question that I had, which is like, what is the difference between a working people centered and a people centered message?
Yeah, so on the first part of that, so I mean, like the actual thing that we tested was, like I said, a very pared down soundbite that we wanted to just keep the different sorts of sound bites as close to each other as possible, so that we knew that any effect that we found of changing from one to the other was a result of the change in the language, and it wasn't a result of just having imprecise language. That it was actually the underlying concept that we're changing that's having the effect, not some sort of just like whatever language that's incidental to the main theme. So what we tried to do was, so here an economic populist would be somebody that's like this. Americans who work for a living are being betrayed by super rich elites. Politicians need to listen more to working class people. Working class Americans need to come together and elect leaders who will fight for us against corrupt millionaires. So we're on the one hand saying that politicians need to raise up and listen to the voice of ordinary people, and on the other hand that they need to critique and call out the role of the super rich elites in creating many of the political and economic problems that we face as a country. And this is a very kind of similar setup to the race class narrative setup on this particular aspect, I would say. And then the difference between the working class version and the non-working class version is, we were just curious if class is something that matters, or if it's just people want to talk about sort of ordinary people in general, as opposed to like working people or working class people. And it turns out that, yeah, the soundbite that was just about, the American people are being betrayed, did much better than the one that was about Americans who work for a living are betrayed. So, we actually didn't find that using working class specific language did any better than just like the people specific language. And then to give you like a very, very like a real world example, these are the types of populist messages that that we have in mind as the real world examples. Like this one on the left is where the candidate's like, calling out his opponent for, being beholden to the ultra wealthy and big corporations, and that he's passing, policies that are hurting, working and middle class families. The system is rigged for those that come out on the top. And then some colorful language, and so he should stop voting for corporations over hardworking Nebraskans. So there's a clear sort of Manichaean, separation between the ordinary people who are getting screwed over by the economic or political elites. That's what we're talking about.
Right. Okay. Well, do you have time for one more, or do you want to jump, Jared? Okay. Anthony, did you see any others you want to?
Kind of an amalgam of a couple of questions. Maybe these are two separate, but I'll just put it out there. One is around a couple of people have raised the whole process of simply listening, whether it's deep canvassing or another listening approach. And one person talked about how that's been extremely productive in allowing them to have conversations about tough issues with rural voters, small town voters. Wondering, I mean, you weren't testing that, but wondering where you see that fits in. And then the other piece is, do you see any difference between what we generally called a blue dog Democrat and a progressive populist? Or is there a lot of overlap, or is there some significant difference between those?
Okay, yeah. So on the deep canvassing stuff, yeah. I mean, I think I've done it myself, and it seemed, I also agree that it can be very useful. My concern, as I think the concern of a lot of people, is, how do you scale that up in a major way, so that it can have like large scale impacts, is a difficult thing. We're actually doing what's called a field experiment, in a few months, with some folks, so a progressive organization, to sort of test different kinds of populist messaging through conversations on the doors rather than through a survey. So that'll be interesting to see, like, if what we're doing here sort of holds up in an actual campaign setting. So we'll let you know how that goes. And then what's interesting of Blue Dog and progressive populist? Well, the main difference would be, well, Blue Dogs don't talk that much about calling out corporate elites, for instance. I mean, some of them do, but in general, they don't. And they also don't really talk about the need for sort of, expansive, jobs policies that could, sort of help ordinary working class people. That said, as I mentioned to you, what we're finding is that the sort of more blue dog style economic policies were kind of landing better with these small town rural voters than the more progressive economic policies that we actually find in this same survey do pretty well among working class voters in general, but specifically among small town and rural voters, the kind of more kind of milquetoast, like, well, important, but, like job training programs, or like, invest in innovation, or, that kind of like sort of middle of the road economic messaging that you would hear from a Josh Gottheimer or somebody like that, or like Connor Lamb, that's the kind of stuff that was sort of appealing to these folks. So I think there is a real problem there for progressives, who are committed to sort of these sort of transformative economic policies, like we at the Center for Working Class Politics are. How do we make those messages more effective among these groups of voters that it's kind of a tough sell?
Is it fair to say, this might be simplistic, that the rural small town voters that are generally favorable to kitchen table and a modicum of progressive economic policies, that it breaks down along the question of how much it's like a big government program, big solutions, versus policies that enable people in their locales to kind of have opportunities, whether it's small business oriented or, I mean, is that a fair breakdown at all?
Well, so basically, we tried to get at this with our next survey, which I didn't show you here, but basically we tested a whole bunch of different democratic economic policies. And my feeling on this is that, yes, that's largely true, but I also think that there are certain things that don't really hit home enough. So if it's an economic policy that's, say, like, I mean, so even something like the cost of insulin, like that's something that, some candidates ran on, and it's obviously extremely important to the lives of many people, but it's something that didn't really register as much. And so I think it both has to be something has pretty large scale implications, but is something that's not implying the government's it's gonna be runaway government spending. So that's something like trade policy, or like stopping bad trade deals. Like that's the kind of stuff that, or like job training programs. Those are the sorts of things that I kind of have in mind.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I really, really appreciate you letting me come on and speak with you. And Erica maybe could send around my email, but it's also right here, jared@workingclasspolitics.org. Feel free to, reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm happy to send you any additional results that you might want to see. We have a few new products that are going to be coming out in the next few months, and we're always interested in collaborating with new organizations. So if anybody has anything you wanted to run by us or propose, we'd love to, or just chat at some point, would love to do that. So thank you very much. And yeah, sorry I had to leave a little bit early, but teaching calls.
Okay, we will let you go. Thanks so much, Jared. This was terrific.
All right. Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.